In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Mary, seat of wisdom, our holy guardian angels and patron saints, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So it's very good to be with you tonight, and the topic I've chosen for my talk is a comparison of the two notions of marriage and family that have come into our society, and what I've noticed as a priest is that very often the church and modern society are speaking past one another, because in fact they have two completely different meanings of marriage and family in mind. So I want to address that and very clearly lay out for you these two different meanings, so that you'll be in a position to say, oh, okay, now I understand why the church holds what it holds, and now I understand why it's not compatible with what modern society says about marriage and family. And so I'll sort of lay out the two different meanings of marriage and family. And then after that, I'll go and I'll talk about why one of those meanings, the meaning the church has always been holding on to, is something which is rooted in human nature, which is unchangeable, immovable, and whatever else, and necessary for human flourishing, while the other one is not, and in fact very contrary to human flourishing, and the so-called, what I would call, collateral damage that comes as a result of accepting these new definitions of marriage and family. Okay, so let me put side by side the two different meanings of marriage that the world is dealing with and that the church is dealing with. And when I say the church has a definition of marriage, what I mean by that is when the church talks about natural marriage, the church also has a notion of sacramental marriage, which is a further refinement of the notion of natural marriage. But when the church is talking about natural marriage, she's talking about something that has been held universally by every culture in human history, and even today by most cultures outside of the industrialized West. Okay? If you go to Africa and Asia, right, you will not find these new definitions of marriage and family. You'll find, in fact, the same definition that the church has been holding on to for more than 2,000 years now. So, what do we mean by marriage as Catholics? Marriage is a lifelong communion between a man and a woman, established by their free consent for the sake of the generation and the education of children. Okay? I'll repeat that again. Apparently it will be a recording, so there's no test. I won't give you a test. A lifelong communion between a man and a woman, established by their free consent for the sake of the generation and the education of children. Okay? So the most obvious thing there to hold on to is that the Catholic understanding, the traditional understanding of marriage that human beings have been using for all of human history except the last 30 years basically, the traditional understanding of marriage has always been something for the sake of the generation and the education of children. That is a key element in the definition. And that's exactly what's been denied in the modern attempts to define marriage and family. Okay? The modern definition of marriage would be something like this: a legal contract between two persons for the sake of romantic love. Okay? A legal contract between two persons for the sake of romantic love. Okay? Those are the two opposed definitions we're dealing with. And correspondingly, there will be two different notions of family. Because what you mean by family, right, is a husband, his wife, and their children. So husband and wife include the notion of marriage, huh? So if you think that family is fundamentally rooted or founded upon a legal contract, you have one idea of marriage and family. If you think that marriage is founded upon the natural inclination to generate and educate children, you've got another concept of marriage and family. Does that make sense? So those are the two things we have to sit side by side and compare with each other. So I want to explain the traditional definition of marriage and take you through all the elements, and then defend a few objections that a lot of modern people would raise against that. So first of all, I said that marriage is a lifelong communion. Now, what do I mean by communion there? Right? Why not just say a lifelong union or a lifelong relationship or something like that, or community? A communion is like a community because both of them involve a multitude of persons. A community is a multitude of persons that are all acting for some common goal. So the city of Pasadena could be a community, your job could be a community, whatever else. But a communion is much more intimate than that. Examples of communions would be friendship, marriage, family, the church, the blessed in heaven, a religious community, like the Norbertine order, and the Trinity, most of all, would be a communion, communion of persons. A communion is a multitude of persons in which each person somehow lives or shares the life of every other person. That's what's distinctive about a communion. And marriage and family are supposed to be a communion. Husband and wife are supposed to be sharing a life. Parents and children are supposed to be sharing a life, living a life together. You see that very clearly in, say, friendship, right? Especially in the friendship that happens when people start to date, a young couple falls in love. Have you ever noticed that when you really get to know someone well, they become a close friend, you really enjoy hearing stories about and seeing pictures of the time before you met them, like their childhood, their baby pictures, stories about their childhood, and whatever else. What are you doing when you're doing that? You're trying to live the part of their life that you missed. It's exactly what you're doing. So once you enter into communion with someone, no one wants to live only a part of their own life, nor do you want to live a part of the life of the person you are now living with, right? That shared life, that idea of a communion is that you want to live their whole life with them. And so you really enjoy, hearing about their past, living the part of their life you missed before you met them. So that notion of a communion as being a sharing of life, a oneness of life, is very key to the notion of marriage. And it's only possible among persons. Cattle can't live in communion. They can graze together, they can be in the same shed together, but they can't live in communion. Because only human beings have knowledge and love by which we can live inside one another, and empathy by which we can experience one another's inner lives. So it's really important to understand, especially for those who are married or preparing for marriage, that it's not just any kind of knowledge and any kind of love that leads to communion. And I'll give a story that really exemplified this for me. So many years ago, I was giving spiritual direction to a young man who had been a student at our high school. But he went off to college, and so because he was far away, I didn't see him as often anymore. But I went to do a wedding, and he and his girlfriend, he had been dating her for about a year, were present as guests at the wedding and the reception. So at the reception, I pulled him aside. We took a walk so we could catch up a little bit. I said, "How's it going with that girl?" And he says to me, "Terrible, Father." Which surprised me a bit, because they seemed to be having a good time together. I said, "What's wrong?" "She's in love with another man." That really surprised me. I said, "Well, what are you doing here together if that's the case?" He says, "Father, let me explain. The whole time I've been dating her, I've been hiding all my faults from her. She doesn't even know that I smoke, because I'm afraid if she knew, she wouldn't want to date me. She's in love with the man I'm pretending to be." Isn't that insightful? Unless someone knows you with your faults and your problems, you're not living in a communion with them yet, because you feel like they're loving the person you're pretending to be. You see that? So, for human beings, especially in a marriage, it's really important that both of you really know each other's faults and problems. You're not hiding things, hiding the warts. And it's a whole different experience for someone to reveal their problems, their defects, their sinfulness, and then to hear from the other person, I know those things about you and I choose to love you. That's a whole different experience than someone who's hiding all their faults and then having that person say, I love you. So that's something I think really important for all of us if we're thinking about, like, how's it going to be for my marriage? How's it going to be in my marriage or in my family or whatever else? To really live in communion means to be open about the bad stuff, especially, and to choose to love the other with their faults. Both of those things are essential to a true communion. So I point out that every communion by its nature is actually lifelong. No one, for example, makes a friend and says, well, let's call it off in 5 years. You know, it doesn't always happen that way. It doesn't always happen that every friend you make is a lifelong friend. But when you get into a friendship, and it is a friendship, you're kind of hoping it'll last the rest of your life. I've had the good fortune and the blessing of having friends that are lifelong friends. You know, the friends I made when I was 12, 13, 14 years old, my closest friends are still those close friends today. Amazing by God's grace, but it's a beautiful thing to have a lifelong friend. So a friendship is by its nature lifelong because a friendship's a communion. No one wants to live only part of their own life, so why would they want to live part of the life of the person they're sharing or living a life with, right? So also, even more so, marriage is by its nature lifelong. Well, what's the next element of the definition of marriage? Between one man and one woman. Now that is self-evident if you admit that marriage is for the sake of the generation of children. There's no natural way to generate children except with a man and a woman, okay? So I'll have to pass on that for now. I'm going to come back to that question and answer a number of objections to the idea that marriage is for the sake of the generation, the education of children. I'll answer those objections in a little bit. But suffice it to say, if you admit that marriage is for the sake of the generation of children, you've admitted that marriage has to be between one man and one woman. Do you understand that? The new definitions of marriage all say marriage is for the sake of romantic love. Granted that marriage would be for the sake of romantic love, then of course there's no limit to, you know, whether it could be a man or a woman, a man and a man, a woman or a woman. For that matter, it could be 3 men and 2 women. There really isn't any natural limit to the people you can feel romantic love for. Right? Most people have had the experience of having feelings for more than one person in their life. Right? This is not something that is an impossibility. In fact, it's more commonplace. So if you're saying marriage is for the sake of romantic love, well then, you know, all restrictions are off with regard to the sex of the persons and the number of the persons that are involved in the marriage. But if marriage is for the sake of the generation of children, that ends the discussion right there. So really we have to come back to that key element of the definition, that's for the sake of the generation of children. Okay? And why is that? And why does the church still firmly hold on to that, and so forth? Okay? Then marriage has to be by your free consent. It's a lifelong communion between one man and one woman, established by their free consent. Now that's obvious in our culture, and no one denies that part, right? Maybe if you lived in, you know, the Middle Ages, or if you lived in, you know, Bangladesh or something like that, people would doubt whether marriage is by someone's free consent. But the church has always held that you can't get married unless you freely consent to it. That was true in the patristic age, it was true in the Middle Ages. If the couple themselves, in spite of their parents arranging the marriage, if the couple themselves didn't give the consent, the marriage was not valid. The church has always held to that. And the reason is very simple. You can't commit yourself to something as difficult and permanent and engaging as raising a family, educating children for the rest of your life. You can't do that well if you're doing it by force. You know, it's hard enough when you did it freely. In fact, a lot of people, when they do it freely, they're like, I was duped. Thank goodness no one knows beforehand how hard it is to raise children. We would be like a bunch of monks or something. So everyone would be religious, I guess. But so it's hard to raise kids. And so therefore, if you're going to do that, you better do that by your free choice, you know. And then finally, the last part of the definition of marriage is that it's for the sake of the generation and the education of children. It's both, right? We're not about just like generating children, dropping them off on the street and walking away. It's about, raising your children as well as generating your children. The two go hand in hand. And notice, if you look at that definition overall, it's the last part, what an Aristotelian or a Thomist would call the final cause. That last part of the definition that holds everything else together. I'll give you a simple illustration. If I said to you, I need this tool, and it's got to be something I can hold in my hand that's for the sake of cutting. The purpose is to cut. You'll immediately say, oh, you need a knife. It's got to be hard and sharp. I immediately reason to the form and the matter based on the purpose or the end. Do you see that? So if I know the purpose of a thing, I know the matter, I know the form that it takes. It's the same way with marriage. If I know that the purpose of marriage is a generation of children, then I know the material out of which you make a marriage is a man and a woman. Do you see that? If I know that the purpose of marriage is the education of children, then I know that marriage has to be something that is a lifelong and stable union, right? I know the form of marriage, right? It's got to be some kind of a communion, huh? So knowing the purpose is pretty much to know everything about a thing. And so that's exactly the part of the definition of marriage which has been called into question in modern times. And that's why I entitled my talk, A Tale of Two Families. There's two different purposes or ends that society has proposed for marriage and family, and that the church and all of human history have proposed for marriage and family, okay? So let's focus on that last element of the traditional definition of marriage. There are two main objections that people raise to the idea that marriage is for the sake of the generation of children. They say, Father, even the Catholic Church admits that elderly and infertile couples can get married, and therefore it's impossible that marriage could be for the sake of the generation of children, right? Seems like a devastating objection. There's no way around it, right? Wrong. Notice the exact words I used in my definition. I did not say marriage is a lifelong communion between one man and one woman established by their free consent who are able to generate children. Did you notice I didn't say that? Instead, I said a lifelong communion between one man and one woman established by their free consent for the sake of the generation and the education of children. Able to does not equal for the sake of. Those are not equivalent terms, and every 3-year-old knows that. When your 3-year-old comes with a little car and the wheels off the car, his little toy car, he says, Daddy, it's broken. What does he mean by that? Does he mean he's not able to use it as a calculator? No. He means it's unable to do what it's for the sake of doing. And every little kid knows that those two are compatible states. Every 3-year-old. This is not a big philosophical distinction. This is what you've known since you were 3 years old. Okay? A blind eye is for the sake of seeing. It's unable to see. An infertile orange tree is for the sake of producing oranges. It's unable to do that. And an infertile marriage is for the sake of generating children, though it is unable to do that. These are not contradictions at all. Not contradictions at all. If I said to you, well, two people, the church says two people can get married, but it has nothing to do with sex. You say, why don't they just be friends? Right? I often do that when I'm doing marriage prep with people. I'm doing marriage prep with couples, and I say, okay, exactly what are you promising on the day of your marriage? What are you going to promise to each other? When you say, I take you to be my wife, I take you to be my husband, what exactly are you promising there? And all the young couples I deal with today, they always tell me the same answer, something or something like it. They say, we're promising to love one another for the rest of our lives. And I say to them, congratulations, you are now friends. It's the truth. If it's all just about loving each other the rest of your life, David and Jonathan made a promise to love each other for the rest of their lives. That doesn't make you married. Well, then they start thinking about, well, okay, then we're promising to live together for the rest of our lives. You are now permanent roommates. Okay, we promise to raise children together. That's what we're doing. Well, a brother and a sister could have a sibling that died leaving their children behind, and they could promise to live together and raise the children together. Are they married? I guess not. Marriage is about sex. The 1917 Code of Canon Law put it very distinctly. When you marry someone, you give to that person the exclusive right over your body for the acts that are apt to generate children. That is exactly the content of your marriage vow. You give to your spouse the exclusive right over your body for the acts that are apt to generate children. Not other acts, not everything you can imagine, just the acts that are apt to generate children. If you do that, you better love them. You better live together. You better raise your children together, should they come. All those are properties that follow from the essence of that promise that you've made, okay? And so once you realize that, you say, oh, even with infertile couples, they actually make that promise. Adultery isn't being friends with someone. It's not even necessarily living with someone. It's having sex with someone. You see that? That's adultery. So that's what breaks the marriage vow. So once you realize that, you say, okay, that means as long as you've given to someone the right for acts apt to generate children, you have entered into something that is for the sake of the generation of children, regardless of whether it's able to do it or not. You see that? So there you have it. There's one simple distinction that overcomes what seems like an unovercomable objection, right? There's no problem with the church saying that infertile elderly couples can get married as long as they can do acts that are apt to generate children. If there may be some impediment materially, the woman's infertile, the man's infertile, that's fine. As long as the act itself is for the sake of generating children, you're still entering into something which is for the sake of generating children, okay? Now, if that's the case, sometimes people will come back and they'll make this follow-up objection. They'll say, well, Father, if then that's true, if it's true that you don't have to be able to generate children in order to get married, then that means same-sex couples can get married too. Here, I'll make the argument for you. Infertile couples are unable to generate children. Same-sex couples are unable to generate children. Therefore, infertile couples are the same as same-sex couples. See the argument? What's wrong with that argument? I teach logic. The first problem is it's an invalid second-figure syllogism. I don't expect you to know that or remember that. But I will give you an example to illustrate. A cow has 4 legs. A table has 4 legs. Therefore, a cow is a table. An obviously fallacious argument. And what's wrong with that argument? First of all, it's an invalid second-figure syllogism. The middle terms and the predicate in both places there for 2 universal affirmative statements. But also it has what we call an equivocal middle term. The common term is used in 2 different senses. When I say that a table has legs and a cow has legs, I mean something radically different by the word leg, don't I? Well, let's look at that previous argument I gave you. An infertile couple is unable to generate children. A same-sex couple is unable to generate children. Does the word unable mean the same thing there? Well, what if I put it this way? My orange tree is unable to produce oranges, and my dog is also unable to beget oranges. You would immediately recognize the word unable is not used in the same sense there. In one case, I mean an impeded natural ability. In the other case, I mean no ability of any kind. An infertile couple has an impeded natural ability, but they can still do the acts that are apt to generate children. The same-sex couple have no ability of any kind. They cannot do acts that are apt to generate children. They can't do that. And therefore, there's no syllogism. It does not follow that if the church allows and if society allows an infertile couple to get married, it does not follow that a same-sex couple could get married. You see that? So just a real quick logic lesson there so you're not deceived by specious arguments or sophistical arguments. Huh? Okay, then there's the second main objection that comes to the definition of marriage and the idea that marriage is for the sake of the generation and education of children. They say something like this: Father, no one gets married for the sake of generating and educating children. They get married for the sake of love. Okay? So all you married couples out there and all you dating couples out there, I want you to imagine this following scenario. Your beloved, that handsome young man next to you, your beloved, when you were just about to get engaged, he took you out to dinner at this really nice restaurant. He sweet talked you the whole time, and then he knelt down on one knee, to your surprise, produced a ring and said, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you generate and educate children with me? How do you think that engagement would go? Probably not very well. She'd first look at you and just say, you're weird. And then secondly say, if you'd like to rephrase that, I'll say yes. So obviously people don't get married for the sake of generating and educating children. They get married for the sake of love. Therefore, it seems to follow, absolutely not, Father, there's no way that marriage is for the sake of the generation and education of children. What modern society says is right. It's for the sake of romantic love. Okay? Again, a seemingly unassailable objection. Once again, overcome by a very simple distinction that everyone knows. Let's say a young man decides to study medicine, and his motive for studying medicine is because he wants to be really rich. He wants that big house on the hill because he knows that doctors get paid a lot of money. Is that the same thing as the intrinsic purpose of medicine? Is the purpose of medicine to make money? No. The intrinsic purpose of medicine is to heal. That's what the art of medicine is for. The motive that someone uses when they study medicine, or the motive they have for studying medicine, might well be greed. Could be the desire for money. Those are not incompatible. In the same way, the motive that most people have for getting married is love, romantic love. But the intrinsic purpose of what they're getting into, the marriage, is the generation, the education of children. You see the distinction there? Now, as long as your motive is not opposed to the intrinsic purpose of what you're getting into, everything's okay. Let me give you an example where it's not okay. Let's say that the person's desire for money overrides his desire to heal people. So the doctor keeps on making you sick and sick and sick, so you keep on coming back and buying his medicine so you can make more money. If that would happen, the art of medicine itself would be destroyed. You see that? But with a case of marriage, it turns out that romantic love tends to assist the purpose of marriage, not to be opposed to it. It helps you generate children if you have romantic love for the person you're with. That helps. It also helps you to stay with the children and raise them well. It's part of a good education to your children that you actually love each other and show affection to each other. That's part of what, a good upbringing looks like for children. So that romantic love, in fact, is pretty much an assistant to the intrinsic purpose of marriage. The only time it becomes a problem is when you try to make the ultimate purpose of your marriage romantic love. Then the marriage starts to fall apart, because it is inevitable that over the course of a marriage that you will eventually not feel romantic feelings for each other for different parts of the marriage. And frankly, I would like to point out, all you young men out there, I suppose that there are very few young men out there who feel attracted to 80-year-old women. When you're 80 years old, you will still feel unattracted to 80-year-old women. So when you get older, your marriage is going to be largely friendship. It's going to be largely friendship, Not romantic love, not romantic attraction anymore. But you know what you will be doing? You'll still be giving an education to your children. Because education in the definition of marriage does not primarily mean an academic education. That's how people think today. It's primarily a moral education. I have a little saying. I say, remember, you're educating your children for heaven, not Harvard. Okay? Heaven, not Harvard. Okay? So, a moral education is something that really is a lifelong activity. When you are middle-aged, you will be showing your adult married children, newly married children, how to love one another in middle age. When your children are middle-aged and you are senior citizens, you will be showing your middle-aged children how to care for and love one another in your old age. And when you die, you will be giving your children an example of how to die well and how to love and care for one another in death. At every stage in your life, you are giving your children a moral example for the next stage of their life. That's why marriage has to be lifelong on account of the purpose of marriage as well. Not just because it's a communion, sharing of life, but also because it's for the sake of the education of children. And the sign of that is no one thinks after they graduate from college, oh, I don't care if mom and dad stay together. Of course they care. They care deeply. They think every child thinks they have a right to be able to look to their parents about an example and for advice for the next stage of their life. So the education of children is a lifelong occupation. So there, that gives you just a simple defense of the traditional understanding of marriage. Now I'm going to show you that marriage, as I've defined it, as the church has understood it, as society has accepted it from time immemorial, is the object of a natural inclination. That is, it comes about spontaneously and naturally wherever you find human beings of both sexes, male and female. You will always find marriage. That has significant consequences because it means that marriage is not a contract created by the state. Before the state of Phoenix or the state of Arizona came around, men and women were having children and raising their children together. Before the United States of America ever existed, men and women were coming together, having children, raising their children together. Before any state in human history existed, men and women were coming together, having children, raising their children together. Marriage is something that is natural and not subject to the state. Do you understand that? That's a really important principle, as I'll highlight when I get to the modern definition of marriage and the way that it contrasts with this one. So how do I show that marriage is natural and the object of a natural inclination? Well, first I need to give you another definition. What do I mean by a natural inclination? A natural inclination is a tendency that a natural thing has for the activities that are necessary for its being or its well-being. I will give you some examples to make that clear. You have a natural inclination to eat and to drink. If you do not do the activities of eating and drinking, your nature will go away relatively soon. You have a natural inclination to breathe. If you do not do the activity of breathing, your human nature will go away in about 8 minutes. And you also have a natural inclination to reproduce with a member of the opposite sex. If human beings do not reproduce with a member of the opposite sex, human nature will go away in about 100 years. You see that? So, all of those activities, breathing, eating, drinking, reproducing, those activities are objects of natural inclinations because the human nature just won't exist unless we do those activities. Does that make sense? Easy enough to see. All right? Notice that when I say we have a natural inclination, that doesn't necessarily mean we have a corresponding conscious desire for that activity. There are cases, well known, where people lose the desire to eat. Some people have a condition called anorexia. Other people, because they get sick for some reason, lose their appetite, their desire to eat. They find eating actually repulsive. Now, if that were the case, what do you think that a good doctor who is not guilty of malpractice would say to someone who has lost the desire to eat? Does that doctor say, oh, well, you identify as someone who doesn't eat, so go ahead, don't eat? Do you think that's what a good doctor does? Obviously not. A good doctor says, I'm sorry how you feel. You're just going to have to act contrary to your feelings. I'm sorry. You've got to eat, otherwise you'll die. Okay? Now, it is also true, and a well-known established fact, that some people lose the conscious desire to reproduce with a member of the opposite sex. Either they have no sexual desire, or they have sexual desire for someone of the same sex, or maybe even something else. Human sexual desires can be all over the map, okay? Nevertheless, that does not blot out the fact that they have a natural inclination to reproduce with a member of the opposite sex, because human nature requires that. Human nature won't continue to exist without that natural inclination. So we don't tell people, well, you identify as someone who feels attracted to someone of the same sex or feels attracted to whatever, and then just say, well, that's how you identify, so go ahead and live according to that. No. Instead, we say, no, that's not good for you. What's good for you is to act in accordance with your nature, regardless of how you feel. Which is fine, because fortunately for human beings, we're not German shepherds, and therefore, our happiness is not found in sex. Our happiness is not found in the reproductive act. So even if we find it undesirable or it's contrary to our feelings, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. Fortunately for us human beings, our happiness is found in the beatific vision, the knowledge and love of God. So we're not less human. It's not the end of the world if people have same-sex attraction. It's not the end of the world if people, for whatever reason, don't feel attracted the way they should. In those cases, if at all possible, I encourage them and just say, look, just like the person who has anorexia, look, eat, in spite of the fact that you don't like it. It's okay. Get married. Tell the person, here's how I feel, but I want to get past my feelings and do something that's really perfective of my nature. And don't worry about it. It's okay. It's something that you can overcome. So it's important to recognize that natural inclinations do not equal conscious desires. And one of the big problems that exists in our society is the following. Our society has taken it as a self-evident principle that if I have conscious desires that are difficult or impossible to change, then I have a right to act in accordance with those conscious desires. That is a self-evident principle in our society today. That's why homosexual behavior is encouraged in our society today. Transgenderism, encouraged in our society today, right? And any other host of things. But the measure of human action and what constitutes good human action is not how strong our feelings are. People can have strong feelings that are really, really awful. We, for example, know that people who suffer from drug addiction and alcoholism have really strong feelings that are often unchangeable about those substances. We don't think it's okay to just live your life following those feelings. No, it's obviously destructive. And people can have very strong feelings, for example, about abusing children. Maybe they can't even change that. But we don't say, oh, that's okay, because you can't change your feelings. You just identify that way. No. So we have to get away from a morality or an ethics that puts morality in our feelings, and instead move to an ethics that puts morality in the objective perfection of human nature. Those things that fulfill a natural inclination, okay? That's why I think it's so important to show that marriage is the object of a natural inclination, okay? By the way, one sign that something is the object of a natural inclination is that it has a natural pattern of growth, development, perfection, and stability. When your organs develop from the time you're a little embryo in your mother's womb until you become a mature adult, your organs grow, develop, but then you get to the time you're a fully mature adult and your organs stay the same shape, size, function. In contrast to that, you have tumors, which are much more exciting, but not so good for you. They grow and keep growing in every possible direction. Well, that's exactly the difference between natural inclinations and unnatural conscious desires. Unnatural desires that aren't the result of a natural inclination, what happens? They grow and they grow and they go every which way direction. There's no stopping them, there's no limit to them, there's no natural stability, there's no peace. You just follow them to the next stop like a tumor, just keeps growing and changing shape and place and objects. But a natural desire, like marriage, for example, it grows, it develops, you get into a healthy marriage, and it's stable. You have a sense of peace, security. This is how human nature is supposed to be. It's boring, but so is having all your organs functioning. Monotonous, but good for you, right? Not quite as exciting as a tumor, but better for you. So, when I say marriage then is the object of a natural inclination, that's something very easy to demonstrate. Go back to the definition I gave you. 1, we have a natural inclination to reproduce. So there's a natural inclination for men and women to come together and beget children. 2, we have a natural inclination to care for the children we have begotten. If I don't care about my own children, I don't know why anyone else should. It's obvious that we have a natural inclination to take care of our own children, and the exception only proves the rule. The people who don't want to take care of their children, we consider them to be monsters, right? Not good parents, or someone who's just, well, on the spectrum or something. No. We have a natural inclination to care for our own children. A sign of that is if you're at the park and your children misbehaves and someone over there that you don't know goes and starts to spank your child, you are not particularly happy about it. Right? So we have a natural inclination to reproduce and a natural inclination to care for or raise our own children. Well, guess what? You have the same children between the two of you. Therefore, there's a natural inclination to live together and raise those children together. You see that? Already, that's essentially what we mean by marriage. But I can also add, we have a natural inclination for monogamy, one man and one woman. It's obvious that one woman with many men is contrary to nature. That's called polyandry, by the way. I don't know if you know that word. It's an SAT word, polyandry. That's obviously unnatural because the man has no natural way of knowing that those are his children or not, right? If a woman has many husbands, then there's no way to identify that's my kid and not your kid or something. So obviously you won't know if it's your kid that you're raising, right? Conversely, polygamy, where you have one man with many wives, is also contrary to nature. First of all, it's contrary to the good education of the children. It often would mean you'd have more kids and you could educate well. There's also natural jealousies that exist when one man is the object of the desire of many women. There's an inequality among the wife and the husband at that point. The wife is only half a spouse, or a third, depending on how many wives he's got or whatever. And also, a sign of that is that in a human species, men and women are born in roughly equal numbers. So that means nature intends for us to have one man and one woman. Lions, on the other hand, I think it's like 4 females for every male, something like that. So that's a sign that for lions, they're supposed to have one male and multiple females, in their pride or whatever else. So human beings are supposed to have one man and one woman. And then I would even add one last qualifier. Also, the idea that there's some sort of public vow is also natural in the sense of it's for the well-being of human nature because it keeps stability in the marriage. If you make a public vow, 2 things happen. 1, everyone knows who's married to who. And that's helpful. Because let's say that you're newly married and you're an attractive young man and you're married to an attractive young woman and you're at work and some lady at work finds you attractive. No wedding ring, no sign that you're married. You don't tell anyone that you're married. Well, she's obviously going to start showing interest in you and that could lead to adultery. And your attractive wife is there at the supermarket and she's got no ring on and she doesn't tell anyone she's married. An attractive young man comes up to her and starts asking her out and that leads to adultery. But if there's a public do not touch ring on your hand, off limits, that helps reduce the chance of adultery, and that's good for the stability of couples and good for the kids that their parents are stable. Secondly, I have a saying. In a world full of broken legs, it is important that there be casts. What do I mean by that? When you break your leg, the reason you put a cast on is because the external pressure holds the bones together long enough to heal because the bones can't hold themselves together. See that? In the same way, when you take a public vow, you have now put social pressure on your marriage. External pressure that's holding your marriage together from the outside when it's broken on the inside. And it gives you time to work on your own faults and problems till the relationship can heal. So that public vow is good for the well-being of the couple, for the well-being of family and marriage, okay? So now we've shown marriage is the object of a natural inclination. It arises spontaneously wherever you find men and women. It is not the result of a legal contract. It is not caused by the state in any way. The duties of the state in respect to marriage are to protect marriage and to regulate marriage in such a way that the natural integrity of marriage is respected in the society. Okay? That's the purpose of the state, only to protect it. Just like the state doesn't make persons, but the state has the obligation to protect persons. See that? When you have a state that exceeds its authority, we call that a totalitarian state, from the word total. And totalitarian states have a way of exceeding their authority in two directions. On the one hand, they try to assume control over things that are natural and not caused by the state. So when the state starts saying things like, you're a person when the state tells you you're a person. You're a parent when the state tells you you're a parent. You're married when the state tells you you're married. You are a man when the state tells you you are a man. You are a woman when the state tells you you are a woman. These are all examples of a totalitarian state, a state that assumes the authority over natural things. If the state tells you a tree is not a tree, you thumb your nose at the state. You don't have the authority, state. That's not in your authority to go around telling me that a tree is not a tree. Don't go around telling me a tree is a dog. It's not, and you can't do anything about it. Dogs and trees existed before any state existed. Male, female, person, man, woman, marriage, family, they all existed before states existed. The state has no authority to change those things, to change the definition of marriage. Okay? That is what a totalitarian state does, not what a healthy state does. The second area where a totalitarian state exceeds its authority is when it tries to encroach not upon the natural but upon the supernatural. And that's when the state starts assuming the authority over religion, over how religion is practiced, and so forth. There's a strange situation that's come up back in Massachusetts. So I went to a small liberal arts college in California called Thomas Aquinas College, a really excellent Catholic college. And they started a new campus on the East Coast in Massachusetts. But they had some trouble opening that campus because the state of Massachusetts says you have to, in your insurance for your employees and your students, you have to cover abortion. Unless, they have this one religious exemption clause, unless every single person that is employed by and studying at the college is a Catholic. So Thomas Aquinas College on the East Coast had to say, okay, we'll agree, we'll only accept Catholics. So it happened a few years ago that a young man wanted to come and enroll at the New England campus, but he was not yet baptized as a Catholic. He was, however, an RCIA. And so he asked, do I count as a Catholic? And so I said to him, well, if you look at Lumen Gentium, the Vatican II documents, it actually says that the church considers catechumens as her own. So then the question was, but would the state of Massachusetts consider me a Catholic? Do you see what has happened as a result of this crazy law? Now the state of Massachusetts is in a position of having to decide who is a Catholic and who is not. That is what we call a totalitarian state. Totalitarian, from the word total. So, marriage is not one of those things that the state has authority to redefine or to change, and family is the same way. Now that I've talked about that traditional understanding, definition of marriage and family, let's talk now about the new modern definition and some of the collateral damage that happens if you accept it. The new definition, as I said before, is a legal contract between two persons for the sake of romantic love. That is a current definition of marriage being used in the court systems today in the United States. I want you to think about that definition. Does it hold together on its own the way the natural definition of marriage does? Or not? For example, why must it be between one man and one woman, or one man and one man, or one woman and one woman? Since romantic love has no particular, if you're talking about conscious desires, the truth of the matter is people can feel romantic love for any number of people. And I will give you a clear case, and I will now be your prophet. I'm going to give you a prophecy right now, because ideas have consequences. Once you accept one idea, necessarily another one will follow from it. Okay? Years ago, I'll give you an example. I used to work at a law firm, and years ago I was talking to one of the young lawyers there. And he was Catholic, but he did not accept the church's teaching on contraception. So I was talking to him for a little bit, and I said, you do realize if you accept contraception, you're going to ultimately have to accept that gay people can get married. This is 30 years ago. He laughed in my face. He said, that is ridiculous and impossible. 30 years ago. I said, ideas have consequences. And as soon as you admit that you can divorce a generation of children from marriage, it's not about marriage anymore, it's just about the romantic feelings, then you have to admit that 2 men or 2 women can get married. And he's like, that'll never happen. So 15 years later, it happened. And he came back to me and he just said, I did not see that coming. I said, because ideas have consequences. You can be a prophet if you just clearly think through things. So I will now be your prophet. In the United States of America, within 15 years, probably sooner, polygamy will be legal, and polyandry. They will be legal. And I will even tell you how it will happen. Somebody who says, I'm bisexual, will say in front of a court, I have desires for both men and women, and it's not fair for the state to restrict my romantic feelings to one person only. Therefore, I'm being discriminated against by the state. If marriage is a legal contract between persons for the sake of romantic love, you have to grant me 2 spouses, a man and a woman. It's inevitable. Ideas have consequences, right? So that's one thing already. Marriage doesn't hold together with the new definition of marriage. It doesn't hold together. The other part is the first part, which is even more terrifying. If marriage really is a legal contract, then marriage is created by the state. It's not just recognized, it's actually a creation of the state. As a consequence, since marriage is a foundational relationship within any family, it follows necessarily that if you accept that the state is the cause of marriage, then you will have to accept that every relationship within the family is caused by the state, including the relationship between parents and children. Now, you might find that or think of that as far-fetched, but I will show you examples that have already taken place in order to illustrate that that is a necessary conclusion from the new definition of marriage. You may have heard the names Alfie Evans and Charlie Gard. Have any of you heard those names before? Those are the names of 2 little toddlers. Both of them were in Great Britain. Both of them had terminal diseases that the doctors in Great Britain were unable to treat. And so the parents in both cases wanted to take their children out of the hospital in Great Britain and bring them to another hospital, it happened to be in Italy, for an experimental treatment for their condition that they hoped might save their children's lives. The state of Great Britain said, and this was immediately following the legalization of same-sex unions as equal to marriage, the state of Great Britain said, the parents do not have the right to make that determination for the children. The state does. The state is a guarantor of the good of the children. So they put an armed guard at the hospital bed of their little children, Alfie Evans and Charlie Gard, as they pulled the plug on the poor little kids, and within a few days, both of the children died. In Spain, when a traditional family movement in Spain was putting political pressure upon the state to allow for an exemption from the state-sponsored LGBTQ and all the other letters of the alphabet there, their state-sponsored sex education program, a traditional family movement said, we should have the right to exempt our children, to pull our children out of that. And this was immediately, within a year following the legalization of same-sex unions as equated to marriage in Spain. The Minister of Education said the following: the parents do not have the right to educate the children. That is a constitutional right guaranteed by the state. It is the state who determines how the children are to be educated. I'll take one more example here in the United States. A couple of years ago, there was a conference at Harvard. I told you you're not educating for your children for heaven, but for Harvard. Thank goodness, because Harvard is closer to hell than heaven these days. At Harvard, there was a Congress on homeschooling. And the entire purpose of the Congress was to start a movement to make it illegal to homeschool. That was the purpose of that conference. And in the conference, they stated very explicitly, the reason why parents have any rights over their children with regard to their upbringing or their education is because that right is granted to them or delegated to them by the state. Okay? Ideas have consequences. If marriage is something natural, then the state does not have those rights over your children. You have those rights over your children. And the state has only the obligation to guarantee your rights. Now, if it happens you have abusive parents, or something that's extreme where parents are starving their children or physically beating them so badly that they are harmed gravely in that way, and you say the state has the right to intervene there, that's not because the state actually is a guarantor of the good of the children. It's because our human nature demands that someone step in and protect them. In the same way, if you were standing by while a parent was trying to strangle one of its children to death, you would have the absolute right to go in and stop that person, even though it was the parent. Because we have a common obligation to our human species to protect our human species. And parents don't have an absolute right over their children, over their life and death. And therefore, those are the instances, life and death kind of instances, where the state has the right, just like anyone else would have the right, to intervene to preserve and protect the life of the children. Okay? So it's an important thing to see the difference between that view, which is normal and rational, and the new view, which is everything about a child's education is dictated by the state, and the parent only has rights delegated by the state. That's a completely different idea, and it's an idea that follows immediately and necessarily from the new definition of marriage. So sometimes people say to me, Father, why don't you just live and let live? We'll have our idea of marriage, you have your idea of marriage, and we'll see just what works out. And what I say to them in response is, you can't change the definition of marriage without changing my marriage. If you change what everyone in the society and what the laws mean by marriage, you've changed everyone's marriage. It's not living and let living. It's a state imposing upon every family, every marriage in that state, a new relationship with the state, a new relationship among the members of the family. And that is something harmful. So I point out, ideas have consequences, and everyone says these slogans like, love is love. Don't be for hate. Well, I'll tell you one thing, some loves are wrong. The alcoholic loves his alcohol, the adulterer loves his paramour. Some loves are wrong. Love isn't love, and human nature isn't the state. So, I'll close there, and I'll open it up for questions for anyone who might have any questions after this. Yes, right here. I don't know, do you have another microphone there? So Steve's going to come down and give a microphone. So everyone in the back can hear you too, just in case. Thank you.
Hold on just a second. Let me.
Would you say that with this decline of marriage, a lot of it began with the Protestant Reformation when they took marriage as no longer a sacrament, which basically kind of relinquished that power to the state?
Okay, I don't think that that's the key element. The entire argument I've been making has been an argument based on just marriage as naturally defined. I didn't bring in the definition of marriage as a sacrament, so it does raise a good question about what do we mean by marriage as a sacrament. So between baptized persons, a natural marriage is a sacramental marriage. And the definition of a sacramental marriage would be a lifelong communion between a man and a woman established by their free consent for the sake of the generation and education of children, and which was a sign of the union of the divine and the human. That's the last element that makes a marriage a sacramental marriage. That last part, of course, that sign of the union of Christ and his church, is another reason why marriage is lifelong or permanent, because Christ's union to the church is lifelong and permanent. So from that perspective, none of the things that I've argued about was actually about sacramental marriage, to be honest. Do I think that there was harm done by not considering marriage to be a sacrament? Yes, I do. But I don't think that harm was necessarily linked to things like same-sex unions and things like that. I don't think it was linked to that. Or even necessarily contraception. I think, really honestly, the biggest influence on the modern ideas of marriage has actually been in contraception. Because as soon as you say, I can divorce generating children from marriage, as soon as it's not about the acts apt to generate children anymore, but just sexually appealing acts as opposed to acts apt to generate children, once you fundamentally deny that aspect of what you mean by marriage, now everything else falls apart in the definition even of natural marriage. So I think that's the key element. When contraception became accepted in the Lambeth Conference in 1930 and by the Anglicans, that's when everything kind of went downhill. So more questions? Over there is a question.
Hi. I was wondering where you get the definition that you've been talking about for the natural marriage. Are you saying that originated with like Plato or Aristotle, or from natural law, St. Thomas Aquinas type thing?
Yeah, it's versions of that definition are found in Aristotle, in St. Thomas Aquinas, in documents of the church and canon law. You'll find it's interspersed throughout parts of human history. Maybe not every element exactly as expressed as I've mentioned it is found in every reference, but it's in keeping with the whole tradition of philosophy up until the last 50 or 60 years, I would say. So it's common, and you can find it not just in the Christian faith, you can find it among atheists, you can find it among Muslims and Jews and Buddhists or whatever else. It's not specific to any one religion. So I was focusing on the natural definition of marriage as a common inheritance of humanity there. I spelled out kind of an argument for it in a book I wrote called Understanding Marriage and Family. So if you're interested in a carefully detailed, reasoned out argument there, you can look at that book there. But as I said, I did not make that definition up. It came to me from multiple sources and all mostly in agreement about that. Yes, it's absolutely not restricted to Christianity, absolutely not even restricted to religion. It's something you will find, and it's interesting, if you read the Washington Post article in response to the decision of the Lambeth Conference in 1930, and the way it absolutely lambasts and rejects that decision about contraception, you're amazed it was a secular newspaper. that was completely against the idea that marriage was somehow not for the generation of children. So it's complete unanimity. If you go back 100 years, complete unanimity. 200 years, complete unanimity. 500 years, complete unanimity about what marriage is. So it's only the last 50 years or so that there's been a change in that. So, yeah. In the back there, and also in the back there, why don't we take over here first?
I apologize if this may be a tangent, but I'm curious,
Uh-huh.
as a single young man and for the single people listening to this, who are ultimately influenced in some way by the secular culture that hyper romanticizes like relationships based on feelings, what advice would you give single young people when it comes to discerning marriage and finding the balance between what you mentioned here and, I mean, let's be honest, we all have attractions and innate desires for certain people with certain preferences.
Yes.
So I'm just curious, what advice and insight would you
Okay.
give us?
Okay, yeah, let me give you, that would be a whole different talk on dating and whatever else in courtship or whatever, but let me give you a few kind of seminal pieces of advice. First thing I would say is trust the people who know you and love you well. Like, trust your parents, you know, and just like ask, like, what do you think about this person? And do that before, whatever you do, before you let yourself fall in love, get through that discernment process. There's a reason why falling in love is called falling. Have you noticed when people start falling, they never stop falling? So you have to make these discernments before you fall in love. Does that make sense? And number one, trust the people who love and know you well and ask them, like, what do you think about that person? Do you think they'd be a good match for me? Let them get to know that person that you're thinking about dating and whatever. Two, if you come from a traumatic family background yourself, then one of the most important rules of thumb is do not marry someone who's identical to your parent of the opposite sex, your mother in this case, right? The tendency is that there's a tendency that when someone's from a traumatic family situation, one of the very well-known tendencies is to reproduce in their own marriage the exact same circumstances of their parents' marriage as a way of fixing it. And what people often find is they have chemistry for someone that's exactly like their mother, for example, or their father, you know. So I'll tell you an interesting case. I had a young man who came to me for spiritual direction, and he was dating this girl who was very even-keeled, had a very even temperament, and sweet, virtuous girl. And he had come from a family situation where it was very volatile. His mom was kind of bipolar. And he comes to me and he says, you know, I really love this girl and she's a good person, but I just feel like I need more excitement and variety in our relationship. I was just like, don't do it. He's like looking for that exciting up and down person, you know. I said, don't do it. You need to marry someone exactly the opposite. You need someone just like this girl. He's like, okay, Father, I guess so. He followed my advice contrary to his feelings. Followed my advice, he married her. Has a wonderful, happy marriage now, you know? So that's one thing. If you find yourself coming from a traumatic background, be aware, have enough self-knowledge to know, like, okay, I'm probably going to feel chemistry with someone who is going to replicate the same family situation I was in. Don't do that. Act contrary to your feelings on those cases, okay? 3, when you're discerning marriage with someone, obviously look at the basics, you know, are they able to, you know, have sex without trauma? Are they able to raise children? Are they excited about having children? You know, all those things. Do you work well together as a couple? Look at all those different things. Do you have the same faith? Preferably, you know, you should have the same faith because it's one of the most important things, huh? But then, one of the things I tell people is, ask a simple question. Is this someone that when I'm 60 years old, I would just love having coffee with and a conversation over the breakfast table? Simple little question. Because all that like intense romance and whatever else, that's gone. It's going to be gone, okay? And then what are you going to be left with? Do you really respect this person as an equal? Do you feel like it's just going to be interesting conversation? Do you think like the two of you build each other up? And then from the standpoint of faith, the other really key thing to look for is this. Do you find that your relationship enhances and strengthens your love for God? Or do you find that it is in competition with your love for God? God's not going to bless a relationship that takes you farther from Him. He will bless a relationship that brings you closer to Him. So those are the elements I would say just look at. And I know it's a quick summary, but to be honest, that's all the time I would have for that. So, someone over here?
Yes. Hi, Father.
Hi.
So how would we clearly distinguish to a secular audience what we mean when we say, like, parents do have the right to decide their child's education from, as opposed to the secular pro-choice stance saying, I have the right over this child living inside of me, therefore I can do whatever I want. And the same concept of just euthanizing your own children, it's like there's possession over the child versus what we mean when we're talking about we do have rights over our children.
Yes. Okay, very good. Okay. So, again, I always go back to the concept of a natural inclination there, rights are kind of limited to the sphere of justice or something like that, where you have some justice. So we have a natural inclination to raise our children. We do not have a natural inclination to kill our children. One of those is the object of a natural inclination: to raise, to feed, to clothe, to educate. Those are all objects of a natural inclination. To kill is not the object of a natural inclination. So that's what it really comes down to. And a lot of times I try to point out to people, even if you could establish that the child in the womb was not a person yet, even if you could establish that, it would still be wrong to have an abortion, because it's contrary to your natural inclination to interrupt or frustrate the reproduction of your child, the reproduction of your offspring, to destroy your offspring even if it's not a person yet. You see that? So for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, he didn't know that life began immediately at conception there, and that you had, the evidence of personhood right there from the first moment of conception. He didn't know that. He thought that personhood happened somewhere between 40 and 80 days after conception. Nevertheless, he taught unequivocally and unambiguously that abortion in those first 40 days was a mortal sin, okay? Because he thought it's contrary to your natural inclinations to destroy the life of your offspring, even if it's not a person yet. You see that? So I know modern people would have a hard idea with that, but I always say, if you're going to go back to some standard of ethics, you have to go back to, does it fulfill our natural inclinations? And that's why it's so important to have a ready definition. A natural inclination is a tendency that a natural thing has for the activities necessary for its being or its well-being. It's all about human existence and flourishing. That's what ethics is all about. Maintaining human beings in existence and human beings flourishing in their existence. That's what human ethics is about, okay? So you have to go to that fundamental understanding of natural inclination if you're going to defend a kind of a Catholic ethic there. It's not just Catholic. I mean, Aristotle had it, he wasn't Catholic. So any more questions over here? Yeah.
Thank you, Father. If I may be so bold, because you were talking about advice for the young men.
Oh, yeah.
If I may add something on top of what you added. Sure. Be able to laugh with each other. After 30 years of marriage, I have discovered that being able to laugh with each other is a fantastic thing. So this is another thing. Anyway, sorry. The question that I have, because you talk about what is the end of marriage, which is the upbringing, education of offspring. So
the generation and the
generation
education of offspring.
Education. Yeah. Can you speak to what is the cause of the reduction in the birth rate, and what message you have for the Catholic, couples that are getting married?
Yes. Okay. First of all, I'd like to point out that we are living in the time that Jesus himself prophesied when he was on the way to Calvary. He met the women of Jerusalem and he said to them, "The days will come when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren wombs,' those who are barren, And we are in those times. People literally think that they're blessed if they can't have children or if they have very few children, okay? Which is completely the opposite of what happened in the time of Jesus, the New Testament, the Old Testament. Even the wicked wanted lots of children in the Old Testament. You know, it says they rejoice in abundance of offspring and leave their wealth to their children, okay? So there's been a complete shift there. So I agree with that. What is the cause of that? I attribute it to what John Paul II referred to as the culture of death, as opposed to the culture of life. And I will lay out the two fundamental principles of each of those cultures. The fundamental principle of the culture of life. Well, let me do the culture of death first. The fundamental principle of the culture of death is there is nothing worth dying for. That is literally the fundamental, the first principle of the culture of death. There is nothing worth dying for. My life is more important than every other life, even the life of everyone in the whole universe. There's nothing worth sacrificing or risking my life for. That is the culture of death. The converse is a culture of life. And the fundamental principle of that is it's worth dying even for your enemies. That is the fundamental opposition between the culture of death and the culture of life portrayed by Jesus and Satan, okay? Because people have accepted implicitly that conviction, there is nothing worth dying for, then obviously the generation and the raising of children involves quite a bit of sacrifice. And once you've accepted, no, there's nothing worth sacrificing my life for, you're going to see children as actually an impediment to your happiness, and the only reason you'll want children is as useful to you, instead of desiring their good and desiring their flourishing or whatever else and the good of our human race and the good of the church. Instead, you're thinking, what can you do for me as children so that way when I'm old, I'm not lonely or something like that, you see? So that has been kind of the fundamental thing. Now, together with that is the obsession with a kind of a lifestyle of comfort and wealth. You know, so in Orange County, the expectation is if you have a child, that you send your child to private schools, that you have them do soccer and ballet and piano lessons, and they have to go to all these nice things. You have to buy them a car when they're 16, okay? Now, if that's the social expectation, how are you going to have more than 2 kids? You know, human beings can't go around driving 8 kids to 8 different soccer games, 8 different piano lessons, 8 different ballet lessons, getting 8 kids their cars when they're 16. You know what I mean? So if the social expectations have to do with, like, I have to keep up with the Joneses, and I have to be as wealthy as they are and make as much money as they are and take a lot of fancy and expensive vacations, well, of course, you're going to think of more than 1 or 2 children as an impossibility. So that's the other component, is this idea of a kind of a materialism that's exclusive to children. And I'm always telling parents, you can give your children the gift of ballet lessons or the gift of another sibling. Pick your poison. So, any other questions there? Okay. Well, good. Thank you so much for your attendance, for your attentiveness. I really appreciate it. I'll close with a blessing. The Lord be with you. And Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Go in Christ's peace.
Thank you so much, Father. Obviously, being in the church will hold our applause, but that was absolutely beautiful. 2 quick things to say. First of all, after joining Father and thanking all of you for being here, we are, of course, back next week, Wednesday night. Just like Father talked about the deep divide between the church's understanding of marriage and the culture's, next week we're talking about the deep divide between the church's understanding of freedom and our culture's understanding of freedom and the consequences. So I'd love to see you back next week. Feel free to invite and bring friends. And then, if you're like me and found it impossible, in spite of a deep desire to do so, to absorb all of the wisdom Father just delivered here, great news for you and everyone you know who should have been here but didn't make it. This is recorded. This will be on the Holy Family Institute website, which is simply holyfamilyinstitute.org under the weekly Wednesday formation tab. So we can all go back and listen again and again and continue to absorb. We can share it to friends, email the link out, etc. I think this is definitely well worth sharing. So thank you so much, Father, for being with us. We'll look forward to having you back in the future. God bless everybody.